Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus Analyzed. This week's affixes are Fortified, Bursting, Volcanic, and the Awakened pattern is still on the A pattern, which is the same one that was active last week. Now, it's been 13 weeks since I started making This Week in Mythic Plus videos, and that means that we are back on the same set of affixes that I made the first video of the season about. So rather than making the same video again, or not making a video this week, I've instead decided that the next 12 weeks, we're going to do a new type of video. If you're interested in just hearing about what is going on in each dungeon, which enemies to look out for, what kind of pathing might be good, you can go check out the previous This Week in Mythic Plus video. I'll have it linked in the description below for this set of affixes. If you're interested in routes from me this week, I've updated all of my routes for every dungeon. So notably, they're a little bit different now than what you see in that video, but you can find them in the description of this video as well, and there's one for every dungeon that I think are pretty good for most dungeons this week. But in this video, rather than going through each of the dungeons and just looking at the MDT like I have in the previous 12 weeks, we're instead going to answer some questions. How good is this week in general? How good is it at specific key levels? Which dungeons are hard this week? Which dungeons are easy this week relative to an average week? So it's not just, I don't just want to answer the same dungeons are good and bad each week, but rather like which dungeons are relatively good this week and which dungeons are relatively bad this week compared to other affixes. And then what specs / classes / roles have an easier or harder time playing this week compared to normal. So those are the questions we're going to answer. Let's get started. Okay, so let's start off by talking about keystone level this week. For keys below level 15, for lower keys, as long as you've got bursting active on the key, it's actually a fairly tough week. This is one of the harder weeks for just blasting through 10s, even blasting through 15s this week. If that's your normal play pattern, is to just, go into dungeons that you're overgeared for and blow them up, bursting actually poses a pretty big threat this week for that strategy. Bursting is an affix that kind of puts a stop on that strategy because it does a pretty high amount of damage. The damage doesn't scale with key level, which means that it is a higher amount of damage relative to the other damage in the dungeon in a lower key than it is in a higher key. And it also means that the damage is done over a shorter period of time the faster you're doing the key in. So if you're doing a key in 20 minutes, bursting's damage per second is much higher than if you're doing a key in 35 minutes. And that's something that means that it's kind of a non-affix in higher level keys. Not really a non-affix, but it's a much easier affix to deal with in higher level keys where it's, 5% of the overall dungeon damage and it's done very slowly. Whereas in a lower level key, it can be like 20% of the overall dungeon's damage and in these huge bursts that can be pretty tough for healers to deal with. So I'd say that this is actually a fairly tough week for lower level keys, but the best week on the calendar for higher level keys, especially when you're starting to I think it's a pretty good week to get your all 15s in time achievement if that's your personal goal. I also think it's a pretty good week to just push Raider IO score. In fact, I think it is the best week on the calendar to push Raider IO score. There are kind of no dungeons that are closed this week. There are dungeons that are easier than or harder than others. We'll get to those later. But there's no brick walls where 50% of the keystones your key could turn into are just, dead keys like there were last week. And so I expect to see keys level 26, potentially higher even time tier. Let's talk about which dungeons those are going to be, though. So at the time of recording this video, the top level keys done are 26s, and they are overwhelmingly junkyards. That's because Junkyard has these shock bots that scale up in damage with the keystone level. So the DPS check is actually really tame in Junkyard compared to most dungeons, as just, you get an increasing amount of damage per key level from these shock bots. I expect to see 27 Junkyard timed this week. I think 28 might even be possible. Look at this. The top run of Junkyard right now is 7 minutes and 30 seconds under, 20% under the timer. So yeah, I think that 27, 28 Junkyard, this is the week where we're going to see that, I believe. For other dungeons, though, and for lower level keys, I don't think Junkyard is a particularly good key this week. I think the Junkyard is a pretty tricky dungeon. There's a lot that can go wrong in there, and it has this effect where if you wipe once, you lose your robots, and that can be pretty nasty. But for high-level groups, for these top teams, I think that we're going to see a lot of high-level junkyards out from them. Other dungeons like Toldegor, also, I think, pretty likely to see high runs of. Freehold in particular, though. Freehold is my vote for best dungeon this week relative to a normal week because it's fortified rather than tyrannical. That's good in Freehold. Eudora is on our side rather than being an enemy captain. That's really good news in Freehold. And just bursting and volcanic, there's not really any ways that those affixes are challenging in Freehold. There's not really big bursting moments. You're not killing a bunch of small enemies at any point in there. You're killing medium-sized or bigger enemies pretty much the whole dungeon. And there's not really any toxic volcanic combos like there are in some other dungeons. Like Toldegor has some bosses where Volcanic is actually pretty tricky. Freehold doesn't really have that. So all in all, I think that Freehold is my vote for dungeon that is most improved this week compared to normal. Honorable mention is actually going to go to Temple Citralis. Temple Citralis, I think, is another one where Fortified, a really easy one in there. Bursting, there's basically no big trash pulls in that dungeon. And Volcanic can be a little bit painful on some of those bosses, but not a huge deal there. My vote for the dungeon that is the worst this week relative to a normal week is the Underrot. Now, I still think that there will be high-level Underrots timed this week. I think that we'll see, we'll start seeing some high-level keys done there, but on the A pattern of Awakened, which is active this week compared to a B pattern week, the obelisks are in slightly worse placements where you have to either fight the fear guy with the final boss, or you have to go out of your way and activate this obelisk in a pretty bad spot. I think fighting the fear guy with the final boss isn't too bad. Here, let me show you what this looks like. It is this one here. I think that it's better to fight it with the last boss, but I do think the Underrot is better on weeks where this obelisk is the blob and not the fear guy, which is the B pattern weeks. I also think that the last boss is actually pretty tricky on Volcanic here. This is one of the spots where Volcanic can be a bit of a pain because all of the spores increase volcano spawns under your group, and you can sometimes just get thousands of them spawning on you as this boss fight progresses. So still a good week for Underrot. Every dungeon is pretty good this week, but Underrot, one of the ones that I think is relatively bad this week compared to how good it is on a lot of other weeks compared to most dungeons. All right, let's talk about which people in your group are under pressure this week and which roles are good and bad. This week is really all about the healers. Bursting is a healer-focused affix, and there's kind of nothing that puts the brakes on how fast you can pull except for bursting. So the main problem keys this week that are going to be run are going to involve healers that are under-geared, healers that are slightly worse than the rest of their group in terms of how well they play, groups where they don't support their healers and where they just extend bursting really badly, and healers that are not as well suited to healing bursting. So specs like Discipline, for example, they can heal bursting, but they require your group to be aware of it and be cognizant of it, and can't really save the group from unexpected bursting disasters as often as some other healing specs can. So it's I think a relatively good week for the specs that have a good time of healing bursting, and some of the other ones it's gonna be a little painful this week, especially if your group is a little bit oblivious and starts extending bursting stacks at a bad time. Another place that is tough, tough role this week is casters that have to stand still and cast, especially healers that have to stand still and cast. Healers that have instant casts in a lot of their kit, stuff like Mistweaver, Resto Druid, Holy Paladin, pretty good this week because you can dodge volcanoes effectively. But healers that have to stand still and cast, casters in general, have a rougher time this week because of Volcanic, especially in big pulls, and especially in dungeons where there are strategies that involve like standing in a snap spot to make a pull easier. So like Waycrest Manor is a good example of this. These Gloom Horrors here, there's often a strategy that involves like having a ranged DPS stand back here or stand up here to make it so that they don't jump because they can't draw a path to that person. And this week, that means there's going to be a ton of volcanoes under that person. And that can be pretty bad. In general, though, just anytime you're a caster this week, you're going to lose DPS or you're going to take damage as a result of the Volcanic affix. So it's a good week for mobile people instead, for melee, for BM hunters. Fire mages too kind of count here because they're pretty mobile, especially during their combustion, they're mobile, and that's where most of their damage comes from anyways. But specs that have to really plant to do damage, I think this is going to be a tougher week for them. One final shout out I'd like to give here is to a website called mplus.subcreation.net. This is a really cool website that generates tier lists based off of statistics about what's going on in Mythic Plus. You can take a look at stuff generated for all affixes or even for stuff generated for specific affixes. Like you can take a look at what has been good this week. Note that this is statistically generated, which means that it's vulnerable to outlier effects. It's vulnerable to one or two people doing particularly well on a spec. It's vulnerable to some weird stuff like Frost mages playing Frost for the first pull of Toldagor being something that, has a very high success rate and makes Frost Mage look like a top tier spec here. Whereas for the most part, these are mages that are zoning out of Toldagor after the first pull. So it's not the be all and end all of resources here, but I think it's a pretty good place you can go to take a look at, which dungeons are good which week, which specs are doing well overall statistically, which affix combos are good here. If you look, though, at this affix tier list, affix ease tier list, you'd find that this week, Fortified Bursting Volcanic is currently in the C tier. As the week progresses, I expect this to move up to the S tier because I think the main reason it's down here is just that the last time we had it was 12 weeks ago and we were a lot less geared. We had, rank 11 cloaks instead of rank 15 with 74 corruption resistance or whatever. So, comparing the runs that were done 12 weeks ago to the runs done 2 weeks ago is going to be favorable for the runs 2 weeks ago, even if the affixes are the same or slightly harder. So I expect to see this jump up on this list, but this is still a really cool website that, having some interesting questions about what specs are doing well on certain weeks. It can't give you a definitive answer, but it can give you some interesting data that, might help figure out what the question is. So shout out to that website, and I recommend using it and taking a look at things here. My favorite thing, okay, this is a little bit off topic for this video, but my favorite thing to do with this website actually is to figure out which talents and traits and stuff are doing well for certain specs. You can just go and look and you can see what essence builds people are running high keys with, and you can use this to kind of identify for yourself, hey, 93% of top outlaw rogue runs ran this exact set of essences, and that set topped out at a plus 27 keys, and every other set only could manage 25. This is pretty likely to be the best set of essences to run for Outlaw and Mythic Plus. For me, this is like the equivalent of simming stuff for single target raid encounters is looking at this page for Mythic Plus to figure out what the best trinkets and essences and stuff to run are. So shout out to this website here. That's something that I use a little bit when coming up with this video. Anyways, that's going to be the end of this video. That was This Week in Mythic Plus Analyzed. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what questions you have that were unanswered by this video, and I'll add it into the videos going forward. And remember, you can check out my previous This Week in Mythic Plus video for these affixes if you would like to see me going through routes for each dungeon and talking about what's going on in each dungeon. Again, updated versions of the routes are now available on Raider.io and in the description below. So the ones that you see in that video are now slightly outdated, but there's still most of what I say about this pack is hard, this pack is easy is still very true. So that can be helpful for you. My name's been Dratnos. Check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.